everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to talk about sexual fantasies. We're going to define what they are, we're going to talk about why and where we have them. We're also going to talk about the top 7 most common sexual fantasies of men and women. First, let's define what a sexual fantasy is. A sexual fantasy is any mental imagery or stimuli that can be arousing or turn us on. They are mostly deliberate and conscious. It's important to remember that because they're different from a sex dream or what we may even consider sexual desires. A sexual fantasy being deliberate and conscious is something that most of us have. Around 98% of individuals report having sexual fantasies. Even those that orient as asexual will still have sexual fantasies. It's a part of our erotic imagination and a very normal part of our sexual health. They're not necessarily things that we want to act out with a partner or do in real life. They become this fuel source and way in which we can engage our erotic imagination and occasionally use what we're experiencing in our fantasies to get us going in our sexual life with partners. So, why do we have sexual fantasies? Part of our sexuality is our mental mind, so it's important to think about things, imagine things, be creative in our sexuality when it comes to sex. Some of the most common sexual fantasy themes involve things that are an important and integral part of our sexual health. So let's talk a little bit about the 7 most common sexual fantasies. Number 1 may not come as a surprise to most of you, but that is multi-partnered sex. This includes everything from threesomes, orgies, and group sex. Some of the reasons why this is such a popular theme is because it's about getting a lot of attention, doing things more exploratory and different than you would in maybe your monogamous relationship. Threesomes, we hear that a lot as being a common theme, and with multi-partner fantasies, this is not an uncommon fantasy that sometimes people want to act out in their life. Number 2, forced or rough sex. This is a controversial one at times because most people find it hard to believe that someone would want to experience forced sex. What's important to remember about forced sex in a fantasy is that the person having the fantasy is in control, which is very different from real life situations of sexual assault. In forced sex fantasies, it is usually the receiving of that and the person feels in control and it doesn't feel traumatic or as an assault. Rough sex can be difficult to ask for, so fantasy can kind of allow you the freedom and liberation to experience different themes in fantasy that may be something you want to work out or experience in day-to-day life. Next, the fantasy of novelty and exploration. This has everything to do with trying new things, maybe incorporating things like pleasure devices into your sex life, dabbling a bit in BDSM. There are so many different themes in novelty that sometimes individuals only have permission to explore and experiment with in their fantasies. This can often give us an opening or a mental rehearsal of ways to incorporate some of those themes or novel experiences into our sex life with partners. Next up, when it comes to fantasy themes, are what we call gender bending or exploration. This can include things from role play or exploring different aspects of your gender. For female identified people, that may include dressing up as a man, doing things like pegging, different activities that may allow you to step outside of what those societal norms or cultural beliefs tend to be. So this type of fantasy can be a way to kind of explore or extend yourself into those edges of your own sexuality. Next sexual fantasy is taboo or forbidden sex. We've all heard of the phrase forbidden fruit. There's something about risky or taboo legal activity that can sometimes really spark a lot of libidinal energy. And again, it doesn't necessarily mean that we want to act this out, but there's something about that forbidden taboo sex that can feel arousing and exciting. This category of fantasy tends to bring a lot of shame for people. They may feel really guilty or shameful about having these fantasies, but not necessarily things that they want to act out, or they're not at risk for any illegal activity when it comes to this level of fantasy, but there's something really arousing and exciting about this theme. Taboo sex. I mean, for most of us, whether you grew up conservatively or with religious influence, we've all heard of things that we're not allowed to do or forbidden to do, so that creates a really strong conditioning when it comes to sexuality. So sexual fantasy can be a place to allow a bit of unleashing and openness to explore some of these things without any shame. Some of the most controversial taboo topics when it comes to fantasies are things like incest, even furries dressing up as animals, things that are just sort of outside of the norm, and a lot of people keep very isolated and internal. They don't really share with others. So fantasy can be a place to feel a bit free to explore and understand and experience something arousing that might not be more socially acceptable to the masses. This fantasy is a great one. Passion, romance, and intimacy. What I love about this fantasy is that this does connect a lot to our real life experiences. I find this a lot with couples and individuals that I work with. The fantasy to experience something that they're not having in day-to-day relational life can be so empowering and enlightening. Passion and romance are so subjective, so the fantasy really provides a lot of information in terms of what that means subjectively for that individual. What's passionate in that fantasy? What's happening? And most people with these fantasies of passion and romance are having these fantasies about self and their partners. So there are things within that fantasy that they can incorporate or integrate or open up in communication with, in partnership, and even try to bring that into their sex life together. And another theme in fantasies is non-monogamy or partner sharing. This goes hand in hand with the multi-partnered fantasy, but it's a little bit different. What we know about non-monogamy and different relational orientations is that relationship is a core foundation in that fantasy. So particularly when it comes to non-monogamy, someone may imagine or fantasize about having multiple partners or being in a polyamorous relationship, and there's something about that consensual, open relationship that can feel really exciting, arousing, or stimulating. So what's important to remember about sexual fantasies is this. It doesn't mean you're a bad person because you have them. We sometimes don't want to even put too much meaning or analysis on them. Try to think about how your sexual fantasy evokes emotion and excitement and response, and utilize that to integrate that into your sex life. Sometimes our fantasies are showing that we're not bringing enough imagination into sex. Sometimes it shows that we are safer experiencing sexual freedom in our fantasies than we are in our day-to-day life. No matter what our sexual fantasies tell us, it's common to have them. It's very normal. So I want to give you all permission to experience and explore your fantasies. Know that it's okay. And if you are in a partnership, I want to invite you all to have open communication. Talk about your fantasies. Also, practice sexual empathy. And what that means is if a partner is sharing a fantasy, don't feel repulsed. Don't give them a reaction that shows them that it's not okay to feel that way. Also, a fantasy is not an invitation to do this activity in day-to-day life. Sexual activities need to be communicated and compromised and talked about before they happen. So because one partner has a fantasy does not mean that the other has to be okay with it and incorporate that into sexual intimacy. If you have any questions about sexual fantasies, leave me a comment, let me know. Or if you want, share what your most common sexual fantasy is. Thank you all for being here today. If you're new to my channel, please hit that subscribe button. I look forward to seeing you all in the next video.